hunker and protect, guard the administration against oversight on its policies, and maybe oversight on the Biden family, which has the potential to get obviously quite personal. And that politically, the administration would almost kind of nurture overreach, right? Try to allow the country to find itself divided, because that is, by many accounts, the kind of trajectory for a 2024 Democratic outcome that's positive. So those are just two of the possible entry points, and we have a just tremendous duo to help us through this conversation. First is BPC's very own Tevi Troy, who will be the anchor of the conversation. Tevi directs the Presidential Leadership Initiative. He is a best-selling presidential historian as opposed to just a presidential historian. There's a significant distinction there. He's had extensive White House and congressional experience, working in a number of prominent roles in the G.W. Bush administration. He was the policy director for Senator John Ashcroft, and he is a prolific writer. So if you enjoy Tevi today, just Google, and you'll have a lot more to work with. Guiding the conversation will be Lisa Desjardins, who is a correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. She has spent almost 8 years at PBS. Prior to that, a good decade at CNN, where she was the lead Capitol Hill reporter. During and after the insurrection in Congress on January 6th, Lisa did a lot of really compelling reporting, and in fact was the recipient of a Peabody Award. So we have two people who both know a lot, but are also good at explaining it, which I think is the premise for today's discussion. And with that, Lisa, let me kick it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that great introduction. Happy Halloween, everyone. I know the times we live in are probably even stranger than this holiday, but thank you for joining us on this beautiful fall day across the country with a lot at stake in the election that is about to happen. And I think I want to just start, Tevi, by kicking over to you. You have done the research on this. I am probably like a lot of voters, where I am looking about 1 foot in front of my face at the politics of now. But you are are able to take a much larger view from your own experience and from your research. Take us through what we know about divided government in this country. What has worked for presidents? What has not worked? What are the lessons here?
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you joining us here today. And I appreciate all of you out there listening. And thank you, Jason, for a great introduction. A few months ago, when I was listening to the Charlie Cooks of the world and seeing that there was a likelihood that we might have divided government, that the Republicans would probably win the House, and as Jason said, who knows with the Senate, I wanted to look, using my knowledge as a presidential historian, but also someone who worked in both the White House and in Congress after a big shift, what has been the history? And we all know from 1954 to 1994, it was a period of undivided Democratic rule. But since 1994, you have had this regular phenomenon of presidents losing control of one or both houses of Congress during their terms in office. It's become such a regular thing that it's worth looking at the history of how these presidents, and we're talking specifically about Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, Trump, and now possibly Biden. And if you go back to 86, Ronald Reagan loses control of the Senate in 1986. So there's 5 presidents. We have enough historical examples to look at this and get a sense of what presidents have done, what they haven't done, what worked, and what didn't. So if we could look in the next slide about the things we're talking about, here are some of the presidents who have lost control of a House or 2 in Congress. So Ronald Reagan, 1986, loses control of the Senate. He didn't have control of the House to begin with. Bill Clinton, most famously, I would say, with the Gingrich Revolution in 1994, loses both the House and the Senate. Then George W. Bush, interestingly, in 2002, after 9/11, he holds on to Congress. It was a close run thing, but he held on to Congress. But then in 2006, he takes big losses and loses control. And then Obama loses the House in 2010 and the Senate in 2014. And then Donald Trump also loses control of the House in 2018. So again, it's a regular thing in American politics at this point, given how divided we are, how close each election is. And so that is what we're facing. And then it's worth looking on the next slide at some of the people who we're talking about who've lost these houses. And, some, as Obama said, in 2010, after he lost, some pretty good communicators there have lost control of the House or Senate. And he was talking about Reagan and Clinton, who are in the top of that picture. So those are some of the people who we're talking about, who are the historical precedents that are worth looking at. And then if you look at the next slide, you've had some interesting characters come in to office as a result of these presidential or of these midterm election losses, including Senator Byrd in the upper corner there when Ronald Reagan loses control. I say most famously Newt Gingrich, in a much younger looking Newt Gingrich, I might say, even though he had white hair back then, in 1994, is the face of the Republican Revolution. But people should also remember that Bob Dole, who's up there next to Byrd, we saw a much older Bob Dole in the introductory BPC video, but there's kind of a younger Bob Dole back in 94. Although I do remember the 1996 election, there were all kinds of jokes about how old Bob Dole was. He's younger than our current president or our previous president or our Speaker of the House. So it's kind of a different era. Speaking of the current Speaker of the House, we have right below Dole, we have Nancy Pelosi, who comes in 2006 as the Speaker, the first female Speaker. And then you can look in the bottom right corner, 2018, and Nancy Pelosi once again comes in as Speaker. So the only person to come in as Speaker twice as part of this process. And you can see, 12 years, she's aged a little bit. So I like that contrast. And then you also have Senator Reid comes in 2006 when Bush loses control of the Senate. And then in the upper right, Mitch McConnell, who is someone that there's been a lot of discussion of, both especially by Barack Obama, when in 2013, when people were telling him you should reach out to Mitch McConnell, he made this joke at the White House Correspondents Association saying, "You think I should have a drink with Mitch McConnell? You go have a drink with Mitch McConnell." And then 19 months later, in the 2014 election, when Obama loses control of the Senate, a chastened Obama says, I very much looking forward to having some good Kentucky bourbon with Mitch McConnell. So he, I guess, had to eat a little presidential crow there. And then also you have John Boehner between the two Pelosi's. This is particularly interesting, I would say, because I was a Republican Hill staffer in the 1990s working for the Republican leadership, and Boehner is forced out in a putsch. There's a little leadership coup against Gingrich. The coup fails, and Boehner takes the fall for it, even though he wasn't really responsible. And then Boehner, I always admired him for this. He just went and did the hard work of legislating for a long time. He became eventually the chairman of the Education and Workforce Committee. And then after the Obama midterm losses in 2010, he becomes Speaker of the House. And it really, I think it just shows something about hard work and stick-to-itiveness and a willingness to just put your nose to the grindstone even after defeat. It shows real grit that Boehner returns triumphantly in 2010. The only one of that assortion of that collection of people who forced him out in 1998, who was not only still in the House, but who ascended to the speakership. So that's an interesting group of people. And then if we look at the next and last slide, we can look at some of the strategies presidents can adopt when they're faced with this situation. There's always going to be more investigation when the other party takes over. And so there should be a building up of oversight staff, people in the White House counsel's office and elsewhere, who can prepare for the legislative inquiries that are going to come. There is some indication that Biden has already begun that. Staff changes are interesting because sometimes there are certain staff members who become toxic or radioactive. I think Don Rumsfeld falls in this category. Back in 2006, when he is someone that when the Iraq war is not going well, there's a lot of talk about maybe Rumsfeld should be jettisoned. Bush refuses to do that before the election, and then he takes this famous thumping, which is what Bush called it, after he loses in 2006, and then Rumsfeld is quickly ushered to the door. The other thing is a changing approach to the opposition party. I mentioned that thing that McConnell, Obama contretemps, where Obama is now saying, I look forward to having the Kentucky bourbon with Mitch McConnell. I don't think Obama really changed his approach other than rhetorically, but you look at Bill Clinton in 1994, who definitely changes his approach and uses the triangulation strategy after the 1994 Republican Revolution. And they actually produced a lot of bipartisan legislation in those periods when Bill Clinton was president and the Republicans held Congress. And as Jason has talked about with me, that it was a period of a lot of partisanship. I remember we had the Clinton impeachment. I mean, there was a lot of divisiveness within government, but there was also a willingness to work together. And then the last one is to avoid unforced errors. Nobody makes an unforced error on purpose. That's why they're called unforced errors. But I think perhaps one of the strategies that the Democrats have in not putting Biden out there so much is they know that sometimes he makes these malapropisms. And I think you've been seeing Biden do fewer of these pre-election rallies because maybe they don't want him to be the story if he says something wrong from the stump. And so I wrote in this Wall Street Journal op-ed a few months ago that you don't wait for the election loss to prepare for a new Congress. You've got to start doing the hard work to prepare for that new Congress in advance. And we'll see if Biden has started to do that work. Some of the work is internally, you don't know about it, but we will really see on election night, if he indeed does lose one or two both of houses of Congress, how he will approach it and what his rhetoric will be on that evening. And with that, I will pass it back to Lisa.
Great. Tevi, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I have so many questions. I'm sure everyone watching this has many, many questions about this. Let's start with the politics of exactly what we're dealing with right now. The House Republicans, let's imagine a world where the House Republicans do take over and lead that chamber. Now, can you talk to us about the margins of that potential majority and what a difference, say, a 4 or 5 seat Republican majority might make versus a 15 to 20 seat Republican majority might make in terms of how a president of a different party might want to approach it? And just to add another complicated layer, because I know you can do a triple sow cow for us, can you also include the dynamics within that Republican majority itself and whether there could, how unified or not the politics could be and what that means for a president of a different party?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa, and I thank you for it. You know, it's always better to have a bigger majority than a smaller majority. So a 4-seat majority gives Kevin McCarthy, if he indeed becomes the speaker, less maneuvering room than a 15-seat majority or a 20-seat majority. But the interesting thing and the real contrast between, let's say, 1994 and today is what the divisions within the Republican Party will look like. So in 1994, if the Republicans win an election and they have a narrow majority, they're concerned about the Connie Morellas of the world, the liberal Republicans from blue states like Maryland, who are not going to necessarily go along with the more conservative elements of the Gingrich revolution. And so they need a bigger margin in the House to be able to deal with some defections on the left. Today, I think any Republican speaker would have to worry about the folks on the right, let's say the Freedom Caucus types, or those folks I think are not necessarily cooperative with the leadership, and they're the ones who are most apt to say, I won't vote for a Speaker McCarthy, or I won't go with the rhinos or the mainstream Republicans. And so while the narrowness of the majority constrains a speaker in either case, the complexion of the Republican Party is so different today that the challenges to McCarthy's leadership would be more likely to come from the right than from the left as it had in previous years.
What's your evaluation then of that? The Republicans have been putting together what they say is an agenda. There are study groups that Leader McCarthy, or working groups, I believe he calls them, have put together over the last couple of years. There's also the Republican Study Committee led by Jim Banks of Indiana, who hopes to be in leadership, who has been churning out a lot of policy papers. But what do we know about a majority in Congress that does not have a president of their same party and their policy goals in recent years? Are we seeing substantive policies, or we've just seen a lot of, especially from the Republican Party's opposition? What do we know about where this Republican Party stands in terms of potential policy discussions, and how does that reflect on President Biden's decisions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Lisa, and there's, I would say, contradictory evidence on both sides of this question. So on the one hand, Leader McCarthy has been saying that he has learned the lessons of 2010 when the Republican Congress came in with great expectations, and they really didn't accomplish that much. And there was a thought that it was a precursor to a Obama re-election loss, right? Obama was going to run for re-election in 2012. A lot of people thought that 2010 defeat signaled that he would lose in 2012, which has happened before. For example, in 1966, the Democrats take a kind of rough beating in the midterm elections, and that was a preview of Nixon's narrow election in 68. And similarly in 74, the Republicans get beat up really badly after the Watergate scandal, and that was a signal that the Democrats were going to win the presidency in 76. That doesn't happen in 2012, in part because the Republicans didn't seem to have an agenda that they could pass and put enough pressure on Obama to get him to sign anything. So they are able, for example, to pass repeals of the Affordable Care Act, but they can't get them anywhere. They can't go become law because you've got the Obama signature blockage. The president can veto that kind of thing. And so there was a sense that the Republican Congress didn't really accomplish that much. So McCarthy says that he's learned those lessons, and he's going to come forward with an agenda and pass bills that can go forward. The problem is that he has put forward an agenda, but it's relatively vague. It doesn't have as many details as, let's say, the 1994 contract with America, which was famously a bunch of proposals with 70% approval rating, and they wanted to get those things done. Not everything in the contract became law, but they did pass a bunch of them, and some of them did become law. And there were some serious compromises with Bill Clinton in the 1990s over things like the Balanced Budget Act and also welfare reform. So again, the evidence is contradictory. I take heart in the fact that Leader McCarthy says he's learned those lessons from 2010, but we'll see what happens and whether he has enough maneuvering room, getting back to your first question, to be able to pass the things he has without too many defections within his own caucus.
You know, there's always sort of an effort, a reach for new words in this town. It's no longer a contract, it's a commitment to America. I don't know what difference that could make itself. But I think it's interesting to watch what that means. Obviously, they're trying to apply lessons from the Newt Gingrich era, and then that worked for the Republican Party. And as you say, lessons from the Boehner era that did not work. At this time, I want to invite everyone watching. We would like your questions. I don't want to be the only one asking questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can ask on Twitter. Use this hashtag. It's hashtag BPC Live. That's BPC for Bipartisan Policy Center, of course, live. Tevi, you mentioned 2012 and the idea that the Republican Congress was not able to get things done. I remember in 2013, however, the U.S. Senate passing immigration reform that year, and it did not go through the House. There was a tremendous momentum in the country, or at least a very large conversation that year for immigration reform, and it died in the House. Can you talk, we've been talking about the House here, but what about a Republican Senate? You know, everyone I'm sure watching knows that if you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, you don't really have the Senate exactly in order to pass policy. But what kind of a difference do you think for President Biden would it mean if there was a Republican Senate?
Yeah, so on the immigration thing, that's interesting, because if you remember back in 2007 or so, the Republican House passes the immigration reform, and then it dies in the Senate. And it was a really close run thing. And I think we'd been able to pass for immigration reform in that case. So I think it would have solved a lot of problems. I
remember that Senator McCain, they were at Feingold, there were meetings everywhere. The Senate was trying to get it done. It didn't happen.
And it was Senator Reid who kind of pulled the bill back and held it over a weekend. And over the weekend, he marshaled support against it. And so it never happened. But I think in some ways, the Senate is more influential in terms of shaping Biden's agenda than the House, because the House can pass stuff that Biden can veto, but the Senate can actually prevent Biden from getting his picks through. Biden, for the most part, with relatively few exceptions, I mean, one of them was Neera Tanden, who couldn't get through at OMB, but for the most part, he's been able to get his people through. They get confirmed by the Senate. Sometimes it's very narrow, with Vice President Harris having to make the deciding vote, but pretty much if Biden picks someone to serve in his government, he's generally getting them through. That would not be the case if there is a Republican Senate, and certainly not if you get 52 or 53 votes. If you have only 51 votes, you might have that dynamic I talked about earlier, where you have Senator Collins and perhaps Senator Murkowski could be more cooperative with the Biden administration. So they would be defections, I guess, from the left. And so that might shape Biden's ability to continue to get his people through. But if you have 52, 53 Republicans, it's going to be very difficult for him to just carte blanche get his appointments through. And frankly, getting your appointments through is one of the number one ways in which you accomplish things on the administrative front. And it's likely that you would see more activity on the administrative front if Biden loses control of both houses of Congress, because remember, Obama said in 2013, I believe, where he said, I now have a pen and a phone presidency. And so that was a sense of, I'm not going to be able to get stuff through the Congress, let me do it administratively. And I think that's a common theme when you feel like you can't pass stuff through Congress. So losing control of the Senate, I think, would have grave implications for Biden's ability to get the people he needs into office.
Keep sending your questions, folks. We're seeing a couple come in. Again, hashtag BPC Live on Twitter, or you can post them in the chat. So we appreciate it. I want to talk to you about something particular to this era that you've been studying, which I call, and I don't think I'm unique, the politics of brinksmanship. And we have already seen discussions, I have this reporting, others do as well, that some in the Republican House leadership, not just the Freedom Caucus, but others, would like to use, say, the national debt as a piece of currency to negotiate whatever they decide they want to negotiate. We're not really clear what the end goal is yet. But can you talk about, I think that actually goes back to the Gingrich era and using shutdowns as a political tool, which I think you could argue didn't really work out the way that Gingrich thought it would. But what are the lessons for presidents in dealing with brinksmanship policy, especially about the national debt, which I think we are going to be talking about, and of course, the federal budget itself and possible shutdowns?
Yeah, well, first of all, brinksmanship is not a way to govern a country. And we've had this problem over the last 20 years where it's very hard to get stuff passed through Congress. I would say the last president who was pretty good at getting stuff passed in a bipartisan way was George W. Bush, but let's say No Child Left Behind. And the fact that you just can't pass things through Congress very easily means things have to get done in a different way. I mentioned the administrative challenge earlier, and presidents try and pass things through regulation, Administrative Procedures Act, executive orders, et cetera. But on the congressional front, there are still things that are must-pass legislation, and those tend to be the spending bills and the debt ceiling. And so those things become the only game in town. Those things are going to pass somehow, some way, even if there's a shutdown, even if there's delays.
I mean, we hope they pass. I don't know. Some weeks I'm not sure.
Right. Eventually something passes,
Right.
even if there's brinksmanship and there are government shutdowns, which, are not a good look for democracy. I think we can all acknowledge. So if that becomes the only game in town, that's when people try and see if they can force their legislative priorities through, because it's the only way to do it. Again, it's not good. I don't want to say it's not good politics, because it could potentially be good politics, but it's not good policy. It's not a good approach. It's not a good way to run a serious democracy, which is what we still are for now. So with that in mind, again, I would hope that they don't engage in this kind of behavior on both sides of the aisle, but it is likely to happen. I think it actually might be a worthwhile piece for me to look into going forward in terms of these types of government shutdowns. My guess is that for the most part, they have backfired against Republicans. Republicans tend to do worse in the shutdowns than Democrats do. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that could be the case. I mean, part of it is media approaches to this sort of thing, but whatever the reasons behind the fact that Republicans do worse in shutdowns, the fact is, if you were to count the shutdowns over the last 30 years, I would say Republicans got the short end of the stick in the media and in the public perception. So again, if Leader McCarthy is going forward on this notion that he learned the lessons of 2010, one would think that he would say, perhaps I shouldn't proceed with these shutdowns as a strategy, because they have not been effective for Republicans. That said, getting back to your earlier good question, if he doesn't have full control of his caucus and there are a couple of members who are just going to insist on it, then he may have limitations on what he can do in this regard.
I do have more questions, but I'm going to try and hold back. I will just add one to this theory of kind of shutdowns and brinksmanship. I have my theory going into it is I hear what you're saying about Republicans. I think that it is generally whoever is demanding something, whoever is the one that is pushing for this brinksmanship is usually the party that loses. And I think we saw, for example, Joe Manchin toy around with some brinksmanship strategies potentially in the last few months, and then he withdrew them. because he realized that, he was politically in danger of what he was trying to pursue. So anyway, that's how I look at it. But let's go to some of your questions. We're going to start first. This is from Doug Dibb. If the final analysis of 2022 is that we still basically have a 50-50 country, even though Republicans may gain both chambers, what kind of mandate do they really have? And what does it mean politically, whether they have a mandate or not?
Well, I think the final analysis, regardless of the results, it's going to be we are a basically 50-50 country, because nobody's getting 60 seats in the Senate out of this. Nobody's getting 300 seats in the House out of this. So it's still going to be a closely divided country, even if the Republicans have a good night, which is what I expect will happen. This mandate thing is a very interesting question. I remember there's a question of whether George W. Bush had a mandate in 2004 after he wins re-election and he gets a majority of the vote. The only Republican to get a popular over 50% of the votes. It's since George H.W. Bush, since his father back in 1992. So it's not been a frequent occurrence for Republicans. And then he talked about political capital, and he says, my theory on political capital is it doesn't do anything to hold on to it. You've got to spend it and you've got to use it. Well, he lost his political capital pretty quickly in that second term, especially with Katrina. So mandates can be very fleeting. Even if there's a perception that you have a mandate and you have a good night on election night, you've really got to do something to maintain that mandate in terms of the backing of the American people. And I think that again, it's a fickle country, as Doug's question suggests. And I think mandates can be very fleeting.
All right, we've got one from Greg Schuckman asking, is there a difference in this midterm election, given the changes at the Supreme Court? And now that we have a clear majority on the Supreme Court appointed by conservatives, would a Republican-led House or Senate, Greg is asking, feel more emboldened because they believe the Supreme Court will back them up?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and the Supreme Court is clearly part of the backdrop. I mean, the part of the Biden and the Democrats' strategy in this election is, usually when you have one party controlling the levers of government, the House, the Senate, and the White House, they're kind of saddled with, well, you guys are in charge, you can't complain about stuff. But they're seeming to claim that, well, the Supreme Court has control, and the Republicans have control of one of the branches of government. So they're blaming stuff on the Republicans because of that Republican majority on the Supreme Court. But I don't really think that the Supreme Court affects what happens legislatively that much. It does happen occasionally that you can have a bill passed that is seen to be unconstitutional in the short term. But even if you look at Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, there was a piece of legislation that Republicans strongly objected to. There was a Republican majority on the Supreme Court, and when it came to the Supreme Court, it was not overturned. Now, that could argue the other way as well, because there's now a stronger conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Maybe this Supreme Court would have overturned the Affordable Care Act. But the fact of the matter is, it's not that frequent that a new piece of legislation passes both houses of Congress, is signed by the president, and then within that term gets overturned by the Supreme Court. So I don't think it's going to affect what happens legislatively in this Congress, but I think it does affect politically. Obviously, the Dobbs decision is part of the backdrop of this election. What happens in the race-based admissions question that is being argued before the Supreme Court today, that's also part of the political backdrop. So I think it's more of a political implication than it is a policy implication.
Got it. Let me keep with this court kind of idea and question here. I know you're talking about policy implications, but you don't see any strong ones. And you also talked about political implications. But I want to go to this question and ask it in a layer of looking at the courts. Matt Whale is asking, what do the midterms mean? What would a change in power in either chamber mean for investigations? And he says, if Republicans take over the House, his question is, how much time and attention would those efforts eat up? And my question is, could the Supreme Court impact that? Because we know historically, many of these balance of power questions, including who needs to testify before Congress, the courts don't like to resolve them. They prefer for the clock to run out and a new president to take over. But are there implications here potentially in the courts for investigations? And then to Matt's question, how much time could investigations take up?
Yeah, I don't think Matt, unsurprisingly, is asking a wise and smart question. I think that if McCarthy is smart, and again, he says he's learned the lessons of 2010, he will see these investigations as kind of a pressure valve, a way to get some of the more partisan elements within his party to get the satisfaction they're looking for in terms of investigating things that need oversight. And whenever you have one party control, there is oversight that will be required. How is money being spent? Is there something behind the Hunter Biden laptop? I mean, I think there are legitimate lines of inquiry that could potentially be looked at by a Republican Congress. But if McCarthy is smart, that can't be the overall sole focus of this new Congress. And nobody is voting for Republicans to take over solely to do investigations. The American people want policy wins, they want accomplishments. And I think oversight is one element of what a Congress does. But I think if they just do oversight, it will be a failure. And I think that's important. In terms of your question about the court, I think you're right that the court really is loath to get involved in this. And I don't think we'll see major changes in the court eagerly rolling up its sleeves and saying, hey, we want to have a say in these investigations. Let's let Congress handle the investigations and the question of who gets to testify. And the less it gets to the court, I think the better from the court's perspective, but also from the country's perspective.
Am I right to conclude from that, that that's probably good for the executive branch, which generally does not like to testify before Congress?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there is definitely a lot of deference to this idea that you have some kind of executive privilege, that there are limitations on who can be forced to testify. And look, we even saw this with the Steve Bannon case, right? Steve Bannon is claiming executive privilege, but for actions that he took years after he was a White House aide, and he was, he was sentenced to this. And there's a sense that executive privilege is something that we take very seriously, but there are limits, and you can't be applying executive privilege to something that happened years after you were no longer in the White House. So I thought that drew an interesting and clear line.
All right, we'll try and get in a couple more questions here. This one is from Doug Sword. Part of the commitment to America that we were talking about from Kevin McCarthy, sort of that very broad outline of ideas. Part of that is to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed under President Trump, of course. Meanwhile, Doug writes, Democrats really want to extend the expanded child tax credit, which is running out. Is there a bipartisan deal to be had there?
Doug, I think you have a future as a congressional aide or maybe a congressional leader. I think that, that is the art of compromise. Each party wants something. And if it's something that's not too distasteful to the other side, you can trade one thing for the other. That's how we did bipartisan trading for a very long time in this country. And just because we've had, I would say, a 15 to 20 year run of not great bipartisanship on Congress, it doesn't mean it's going to go away completely. It doesn't mean we can't have it. And in fact, the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is sponsoring this great forum, is premised on the idea that we can have these bipartisan agreements. So I think it's a good suggestion. And I think that's the kind of thing that should be thrown out there in a new Congress. And I also think that if President Biden is going to look at these previous models that we saw in the slide, I think he would be wisest if he were to look at that 1994 Clinton model, which did allow for compromises on both sides of the aisle. Both sides had to give stuff up, but they also accomplished a lot of things for the American people. And I know the 1990s, at least you and I were both there back then, was seen at the time as a period of great partisan tumult. Now we look back at the 1990s as a period of peace and prosperity, and also a lot of bipartisan accomplishments.
It's amazing. I know, Tom Daschle. It's a whole different, everything looks completely different now, relatively. To follow up on this, though, it's been frustrating a bit as a congressional reporter that for some years, this year is an exception, but for some years, there has been great bipartisan agreement on one thing. Let's spend a lot of money, and that's really what Doug's question is about. To make a deal over these tax cuts, it would basically be adding to the national debt. I do not expect the parties to pay for those kinds of things, although the Democrats have had a lot of proposals this year and in the past Republicans sometimes. But can you talk about the politics of that? I mean, at what price compromise, and how has that sort of been like the common denominator? Let's just all agree to spend money in a big omnibus.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it is a little depressing how much Congress spends without really thinking about pay for us. And for the most part, they've been able to skate by without major consequences. But in recent years, we've seen the advent of inflation, and I think that is based in large part in the sense that we just have too much in debt. And in fact, in one of my books, Shall We Wake the President, I talk about disasters. And I say the most predictable disaster we face going forward is some kind of massive economic collapse based on our unsustainable level of debt. And I wrote that in 2016. I think it's still true today. And I think we really do need to start thinking about it. However, I think it's unlikely that this likely configuration of a Biden presidency and a Republican Congress is going to address that. But I do think it is something we're going to have to address sooner rather than later.
I mean, it was a Paul Ryan, Patty Murray negotiation to have at least some kind of guardrails on spending. Those caps generally were erased, but I think the fact that there ever were caps probably contained spending in some form. But I hear you, the dynamics are different now. All right, we have one more question. This is from Zach Cohen. How have congressional majority flips in past midterms changed lawmakers' strategies and priorities in lame duck sessions before, as we know, leadership offices, and in fact, before any offices really change hands? So let's talk about the lame duck session coming up, because there's a lot on that agenda potentially. How could a flip in the past, how has that affected lame ducks, and what do you see for this one?
Yeah, I think it's a great question by Zach. And look, lame ducks give some additional maneuverability in some cases because you have retiring members or defeated members who are going to be moving on. And they said, well, I'll take this vote that I might not have taken if I were still politically viable. And I'll take this vote. It might be a bipartisan compromise. It might be on something difficult like spending cuts or some kind of pay for. And so I think it gives a little more maneuverability. At the same time, sometimes you see this limitation in the lame duck session because there's a sense that you want to run out the clock. If you're, let's say, the Republicans, you don't want the all Democratic House, Senate, and presidency to pass too many things in this 3-month period while they still have undivided control. And the Republicans are kind of chomping at the bit saying, if we can only wait till January, then we're going to have control of at least one chamber, and we will be able to stop some of these things from happening. So I think lame duck can go both ways, and I'm just not sure how this one's going to play out. It also depends how Biden plays it on the night of the defeat, if there is one. Does he take a more gracious approach and congratulate the incoming Republican leaders and say pledge to work with them, or does he kind of take a more defiant approach? And I think that could determine how the lame duck session plays out.
It does feel like the U.S. Senate in particular has stacked up the to-do list for lame duck, for this lame duck in a way that I've never seen before. And that has to do with, of course, these bipartisan senators you're mentioning, in part Susan Collins, who I know would love to be probably appropriations chairman next time, but I think they all realize that with the House changing hands, I think there's some Republicans in the Senate that are nervous that their bipartisan deals will only pass with a Democratic House, for what it's worth. But I think that's it. I have one last personal question for you, Tevi, and forgive me if this gets too personal. What are you doing election night? How are you watching the results? What's your plan?
It's a great question. Usually my wife and I watch the election returns together, but I've gone to some great election parties over the years, and we'll see. I remember a great one in 2002 at Jonah Goldberg's house, when there was a sense that the Republicans weren't going to win because the history is that you don't do so well. And then there was a big surprise that the Republicans were able to hold on. So, there've been some fun election night parties in my past. We'll see what happens this year.
This one I think is going to go late. What's your cutoff time usually for a midterm? When are you like, I'll wait till the morning? What time do you turn in?
Yeah, so I'm 3 a.m. for a presidential, but midnight for a midterm.
It's understandable. Listen, Pennsylvania, Nevada, it could be a while, folks, on what happens with this year's midterms. But I'm all in. I will be here at our NewsHour offices live with Judy Woodruff. So we'll be all in it together. I've got to thank everyone, but especially thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for, again, a constructive, pragmatic, and important discussion in this incredibly high stakes time. You can follow me on Twitter at Lisa D News. Some of you already do. You can follow Tevi at Tevi Troy. And we just appreciate all of you for joining us. Oh, I can't forget Bipartisan Policy Center. You probably know at BPC_bipartisan. So stay tuned for more from the center and from all of us. We appreciate your time. Everyone have a happy Halloween.
Thank you.